Hello, these are the notes for problem set 4. If you look on the schedule, it says that the chapters for problem set 4 are chapters 26 through 31. However, I'm really only focusing on chapters 27 through 30. So if you want to read about cryptocurrency, chapter 26, be my guest. I'm not going to cover that. That's a very dynamic field. Let's just suffice to say that. And then the chapter 31 is, in my opinion, not that important, but go ahead and read those. They're short, but as I said, I'm going to focus on chapters 27 through 30. That is what is, there's some questions on problem set 4 from those chapters. And then of course, on the first exam, you may see some problems or some questions from those chapters. Okay, so let's start with chapter 27, which talks about the value of the dollar. So the dollar is constantly fluctuating against other currencies when we look at the exchange rates. And so what does it really mean for us and for other people of other nations when we have a strong dollar versus a weak dollar? So who benefits from a strong dollar and who benefits from a weak dollar? So think about, so basically, let's think about it in terms of us. If we have a weak dollar, then it's really expensive for us to travel abroad, right? Because if it's a weak dollar, other currencies are stronger against the dollar, so our dollar buys less. So if we go down to Mexico, or if we go up to Canada, or we go to wherever, Europe, our dollar is going to buy less. So a strong dollar is good news for consumers because it increases our purchasing power. So if we go abroad, then it's a lot cheaper for us the dollar purchases more. It's a lot cheaper for us. So just for example, I can remember when going down to Mexico, it was 10 pesos to the dollar. Last time I went, it was about 20 pesos to the dollar. So we've theoretically, we've doubled our purchasing power, but they've increased prices. Of course, that hurts the Mexican or the Mexicans or anybody living down there. But so a strong dollar, good for U.S. consumers. It makes it cheaper for us when we travel, and also it makes imports cheaper. So if any goods that are being imported to our country, it makes those cheaper. The strong dollar is bad news for U.S. producers, though, because it makes our exports more expensive. In addition, you don't really see this a lot in most, they don't talk about this in the book, this third sentence here, and you don't see this much, but in finance, this comes up from time to time, and I teach this in my finance classes. A strong dollar also reduces profits for U.S. companies who are doing business in other countries. So think of it and this is why. Actually, the dollar's been strong really for about the past decade, which is really interesting because when we had the turn of the last century, 2000 to 2010, we had the U.S. market had some ups and downs, and when we were coming out of that recession, 2007 to 2009, in the popular press, on CNBC, all these experts were saying that, oh, the dollar was weak then, and all these experts were saying, oh, the dollar's weak. Whereas the 1800s, that was the century of England, when England was a major power. The 1800s, I'm getting confused with my centuries here. 1800s, England ruled. 1900s, 1900 to 1999, the US ruled, and they were saying the next century, the century of the 2000s, which is 21st century, it's going to be China. The yuan is going to rule, blah, blah, blah. So, and it was all doom and gloom. Well, what happened? We recovered from the recession. All of a sudden, the dollar's strong again, and the dollar has remained really the world currency. So anyway, I guess the moral of that story is don't listen to experts, because they don't really know anything. No one can predict the future. So anyway, getting back to this, if you have a strong dollar and you're doing business overseas, your profits are in the foreign currency. So when you convert your profits back to US dollars, you get a bad exchange rate. And so that's why a strong dollar reduces profit for US companies. And in fact, when we had a strong dollar, it's still strong, but when the dollar really increased in value against these other currencies, I can remember specifically Apple about 5 years ago, they had a quarterly earnings report and they were warning, they said our profits are going to be lower than we anticipated because of the strong dollar. So anyway, that's how a strong dollar reduces profit for US companies who are doing business overseas in other countries, because when they convert their profits from the foreign currency back into dollars, they get they're hurt by the exchange rate. Also, what some companies will do will hedge. Some companies they will buy these contracts that will guarantee them a certain a certain exchange rate to try to limit their risk. But anyway, getting back to the main points of this chapter, who benefits from a strong dollar? We benefit from a strong dollar. US producers do not benefit from a strong dollar because it makes US exports more expensive. Anyone traveling into this country, it's going to make their purchasing power is going to be less. So they will not benefit from a strong dollar. So of course, it's just the opposite with a weak dollar. So the weak dollar, bad news for US consumers, because when we travel abroad, it's going to cost us more money. The dollar buys less and it makes imports more expensive. Of course, it's good news for producers because it makes our exports much cheaper. Here's really in my opinion, of course, it's good news for producers, but bad news for consumers. So for decades, we had a weak dollar, 70s and 80s, we had a weak dollar. The only good news about a weak dollar really is that it reduces the trade deficit because exports become cheaper than imports. So we export more. We always import more than we export. We've had this huge trade deficit, but it's not quite as bad when we have a weak dollar because we're importing. The imports increases relative to the exports increase relative to the imports. Okay, so those are the main takeaways from chapter 27. So just make sure you understand who benefits from a strong dollar, who benefits from a weak dollar. Okay, 28, Eurozone. Okay, so the Eurozone, they've added, in this latest edition of the book, they've added Brexit. So read that chapter. And basically what they're talking about here is we have this Eurozone, and there's some companies that are in the Eurozone really shouldn't have ever been let into the Eurozone. So Germany is a very strong Germany is a very strong country. They have a really high GDP. They're very productive. Italy, Greece, and Spain, not so productive. Let's pick on Greece. Greece does not have a very high GDP. Their debt is very high. They're not a very productive country. They did not really give transparent financial statements. They basically lied about their solvency, or, how well they were doing when they were let into the euro. They really should have never been let into the euro. So again, when we were having the Great Recession, 2007, 2009, the markets were really volatile because they were talking about this Greek bailout. Greece was defaulting on their bonds, or they were about to default on their bonds, and Germany had to bail them out. So there's a question, should we just let Greece go? Should we kick Greece out of the euro? Should they kick Greece out of the Eurozone? And the answer is no, because that'll cause a bunch of volatility. But they're in there now, and basically you've got Germany propping up these countries that are weaker countries and less productive. And the German people are really upset because, for example, the German people work to a certain age and they have a Social Security, and there's more benefits, there's more handouts, if you will, or there's more, in-kind transfers, I guess is the proper term. There's more in-kind transfers in Greece than in Germany. And so basically it just feels as though Germany is propping up these weaker countries. So that's the whole problem with this Eurozone. But these countries are problematic, Greece, Italy, and Spain, but they're not going to be kicked out anytime soon. So how does moral hazard fall into this? Well, basically, you've got countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain who can take more risks, threaten to default on their bonds because they know they're going to be bailed out by the stronger countries in the Eurozone. All right, so that's what the gist of chapter 28 in a nutshell. Okay, now let's see here. Oh, the Big Mac Index. This is super interesting chapter. So make sure you read this chapter thoroughly. So with the Big Mac Index, for years, economists have tried to do a comparison of, what's it like to live in one country versus another. And it's really hard to compare apples to apples. So initially, they were trying to compare exchange rates. They were looking at the exchange rates among countries, but they found that you can't just look at the exchange rates. That doesn't allow you to compare apples to apples. You've got to really look at the cost of living. So when you look at on an exchange rate basis, if you compare the US to India on an exchange rate basis, people in the US are approximately 35 times richer than people in India, okay? When you compare the US to China on an exchange rate basis, US citizens approximately 7 times richer than Chinese citizens. US to Russia, 6 times. US citizens 6 times richer than Russian citizens. So that's on an exchange rate basis. 35 times in India, 7 times in China, comparing US to India 35 times, US to China 7 times, US to Russia 6 times. Now, when you look at the cost of living, which is what we call purchasing power parity, when you look at the PPP, which is purchasing power parity, they try to adjust for the cost of living because it's not really fair to say that people are 35 times richer in the US than in India because it's much cheaper to live in India. You don't need as much money to have a comparable standard of living. So they tried to look at what's called purchasing power parity. So when you look at the true cost of living, which is the purchasing power parity, that the factor reduces down to 9 times for India. Then the US is people in the US are only 9 times richer than the typical person in India. We're only 3 times richer than the typical person in China, and we're only 2.5 times richer, according to economists, than the typical person in Russia. But these purchasing power parity adjustments are difficult to make for each country. It's difficult. So they were trying to figure out, well, is there some product or something that we can use that is the same in all countries? So some economists had the bright idea of the Big Mac. There's even McDonald's since the fall of Russia, since the fall of the USSR in the 90s, McDonald's is in Russia. So McDonald's is everywhere. And so enter the Big Mac. So on a little side note here, today's March 28th, actually the 29th, 2022. So it's March of 2022. This is the midst of Russia invading the Ukraine. And so a couple of weeks ago, there was a McDonald's, because of the economic sanctions, the McDonald's have closed in Russia. There was a line blocks long around the block for people in Russia, for people trying to get their last Big Mac in before the McDonald's closed. So anyway, getting back to this, they decided that the Big Mac is a great thing to use to compare apples to apples because it's pretty much made the same way in every country. And so we can compare the price of a Big Mac and use that as a proxy for standards of living. Okay, so so if you read pages, read the whole chapter, but especially on page 195, they talk about, they give you some real interesting info on the Big Mac Index. So for example, if you go to Switzerland, the Big Mac costs $6.60. If you go to the United States, at the time that this was written, the Big Mac was $5. So what does that tell you? If you go to Switzerland, you're paying $6.60. If you go in the US, you're paying $5. So that tells you that the dollar doesn't go very far in Switzerland. If you go to Switzerland, the cost of living is higher. Your dollar's not going to go as far. Now, if you go to China, you're only going to pay $2.80 for a Big Mac. So the dollar is going to go further in China. So that's what they're using as the Big Mac index is just a way to standardize things. So then they took it further, and the upshot of that is that the income using exchange rates, they say that the income in Switzerland was about 80,000 compared to 56,000 in the United States. However, after looking at the Big Mac index, they were saying that the real income in Switzerland is really only about 60,000 versus 56 for the US. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, the Big Mac index is a way for us to really standardize the cost of living. It does an effective job at standardizing the cost of living in these various countries. Okay, now they take it further. They can figure out what real wages are based on Big Macs per hour. So that's kind of interesting. If you're a low skilled worker in the United States, you're earning 2.5 Big Macs per hour compared to 3.1 Big Macs per hour if you worked in worked in Japan. In Canada and Western Europe, you're paid about 2.2 Big Macs per hour. In Russia, you're paid 1.2 Big Macs per hour. And Eastern European workers are collecting 0.8 Big Macs per hour. China is 0.6, India is 0.4. So that's a real interesting comparison of the wages that people are making. All right, and then finally on page 196, they talk about productivity and using the Big Mac per hour index to give us an idea of how productivity is evolving around the world. So they say, as an example, between 2000 and 2007, MIC wages in the United States rose by 13%, while the price of a Big Mac jumped by 21%. So that tells us what? That tells us that real wages have actually fallen 8%. You can read more details about that. And it also, so real wages fell in the US, but in China, real wages rose, and also in India, real wages rose. Of course, they're much lower. They have a longer way to go, further to go. So anyway, that's the gist of that chapter, with really interesting about this, about the Big Mac index. Okay, and then finally, globalization. We talked a little bit about free trade in chapter 1, but here's the gist of free trade. If each country specializes in what they have a comparative advantage in, then through free trade, we have this increased efficiency, more productivity, and higher standards of living overall. So let's just say, for example, obviously we have high costs of labor in this country. So these developing countries, they have a comparative advantage, what we call a comparative advantage in labor. Labor is a lot cheaper. So they're more efficient in labor and labor intensive things. We're more efficient in more high-tech types of jobs. So if we specialize in what we do best, if they specialize in what they do most efficiently, you have higher productivity overall. So it's much more efficient. You have higher productivity, goods become cheaper, and it raises everyone's standard of living. It raises GDP overall. So everybody, the macro or the gross total, or in the macro sense, everyone benefits from free trade because we have higher standard of living overall. But there are winners and losers. Of course, the winners are pretty much, overall the net benefit is increased, but there's losers from free trade. The losers from free trade are the people who have lost their jobs. And cannot be retrained. So if you think about somebody who was an unskilled worker working in a manufacturing plant, that is, let's say a textile plant, in the South, or a textile plant back East. What was I looking at the other day? I was reading this article in the Wall Street Journal about a year ago. There's no more salmon, there's no more sardine canneries in the US. You can think about all these manufacturing jobs that have left the US. So if you had a job like that, you're going to have to be retrained to do something else. And or working in the car manufacturing industry in Detroit. So if you can't be retrained, or you never get that level of job that you had before, you're losing. So there are winners and losers from free trade, but overall there's a net gain. So why, you might ask yourself, obviously free trade is good. Free trade benefits all of us overall. It increases standards of living dramatically. And all you really have to do is look at the cost of clothing, the cost of goods. We have so much stuff. We have so many consumer goods now compared to prior generations. It's unbelievable. And I remember when we had the Great Recession, 2007, 2009, and people were really freaking out, and initially, and in 2007, thinking we were going to go into a Great Depression. And I was watching, I think it was CNBC, they had this economist on, and they asked the economist, are we going to go into another, are we going to have another Great Depression where 1 in 4 people are out of work? There's bread lines and so forth. And he said no. And he said, really, for these two reasons, food and clothing is so much cheaper now than it was back in the 30s. So if you think about it, food is much cheaper. Of course, we think it's expensive when we go to the grocery store, but relatively, the amount of your pay that you have to spend on food is much cheaper than it used to be. The amount of money that we have to spend on clothing is so much cheaper. And that's largely because of free trade. Okay, so then you might ask yourself, well, why are these politicians always clamoring on about that free trade is bad and we should bring jobs back to the US, and we should have tariffs and quotas? I mean, think about Trump. He ran on that platform and it was very popular. And there's a lot of people, very smart people, who are against free trade. Well, this is why, because think about a politician. A politician wants to get elected, right? So think about a governor or a senator in some state, or a congressman or a congresswoman. They want to get elected by their constituents, right? Well, if you're running in Pennsylvania, or if you're running up in Michigan, or running for politics in the Rust Belt, so to speak, of course you're not going to speak out in favor of free trade, because none of your constituents would vote for you because they want jobs back. So basically that system, and also the system of lobbyists that we have, it's basically they're benefiting a few at the expense of all of us. So they want to get elected, they want the votes, but it's really not beneficial to all of us. It's just beneficial to that group. All right, so to sum up, free trade is good. In theory, free trade is and in practice, free trade is good, because you do have some losers from free trade, but in the long run, they should adapt, find other jobs, and we should benefit. We benefit overall from free trade. And remember, creative destruction, which I talked about in chapter 2, I think. Creative destruction is a natural process. When you have innovation, and you can think about free trade too, because companies are going to go where the costs are lower. And so that's an efficiency. If you allow in creative destruction is when businesses that no longer have an effective business model, or have products or services that people no longer want, those should be allowed to go by the wayside. And we need to, so that's just a natural process. So free trade helps with that creative destruction, and it's a process that we need to allow to happen, and not artificially prop up like with these too big to fail programs. Trump was right about one thing, and I'm not playing politics here, but and Trump wasn't the first to say this. Bush said this. Other presidents that we've had have said this. Free trade works as long as everybody plays fair. And one of the reasons why Trump was so pro, the tariffs and the quotas and stuff, is because the rest of the country or the rest of the world hasn't played fair with us. We pretty much have free trade, but these other countries have had some pretty stiff quotas and tariffs on our products. And so free trade only works when everyone's playing fair. So it wasn't a level playing field is the point that I'm making. So Trump did have a point, even though I disagree that, I believe in free trade, but he was right that it wasn't a level playing field. In other countries, we were letting other countries take advantage of us. For example, I read this article once about an extreme case. Try exporting rice to Japan. It's just about impossible to do, because they don't want our rice because it's cheaper. Also, this is kind of interesting. You hear about, we're not the only ones who complain about free trade too. The NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that was the North American Free Trade Agreement was an agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And so that was, of course, controversial because it makes sense because there's free trade. We're gonna benefit overall. But they were saying, well, people who are against it were saying, oh, all these jobs now are going to go to America, go down into Mexico, to the cheap labor, and the American workers going to lose out. Again, those people have to be retrained. There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about 6 months after NAFTA was passed, and it said that a lot of companies really should do their research and think about the unintended consequences of free trade. For example, you go down to Mexico and you set up a plant, you've got to set up housing for the workers. You've got to set up the infrastructure. So there were a lot of hidden costs that people didn't realize. And then this is something I never thought of, but I go down to Mexico occasionally. We have a good friend who runs a boutique hotel in Cozumel, and we have some friends who live in Playa del Carmen. Anyway, long story short, the Chiapas, the state is a state in Mexico. They grow a lot of corn there, mostly farmers. Well, they've really suffered. A lot of those Chiapas, the farmers in the Chiapas have been put out of work. Why? Because of cheap corn being imported but we're exporting corn to Mexico, or corn imports coming from the US into Mexico. So that's so we weren't the only ones who had issues with workers losing their jobs, is my point. So again, it comes down to, you got to be practical about the career that you choose. And sure, it's great to do something that you love, but balance. Hopefully you get in most of you are working, but hopefully you get into a career that you like, but you want to balance that with something that's practical, that will give you a living wage there's a demand for. And then you always have to be, learning and just thinking of, you've got to be nimble on your feet, and you've got to continue to make yourself marketable just in case, because we are in a dynamic economy, a dynamic environment. Okay, so I went a little long-winded there, but that's the end of the paperback book. I hope you really enjoyed this book. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned this when I went over the syllabus. I love this book. I've been teaching economics for years, and when I came across this book, I thought, there's finally a book out there that's really interesting to read, that explains about economics in real world terms, and isn't just a bunch of graphs and calculus and theory. And so I really do like this book. So I hope you enjoyed it. And after the exam, we will move on to the second book. Not as interesting, I'll warn you, but it's on managerial economics, which is it's a micro approach. So we will be doing that book next. But I hope, again, I hope you enjoyed this book. Really, really interesting read, I think. Okay, until next time, I will, that's it for now. And I'll see you next time when we start talking about managerial econ or the microeconomics. Take care.